The Old Switcheroo, A Tale of Two Parties. If you have ever tried to explain American history to a terrifyingly literal alien or a particularly stubborn uncle at Thanksgiving, you have likely run into the buzzsaw of confusion known as the party switch. This is the historical phenomenon where the Democratic and Republican parties essentially looked at each other across the aisle, nodded slowly, and agreed to swap personalities like a political version of Freaky Friday. It is a shift so profound that it renders nearly all 19th century political rhetoric ironically hilarious to modern ears. Let's rewind to the 1860s, a time when facial hair was unkempt and the country was actively falling apart. Back then, the Republicans were the radicals. Yes, the grand old party was the party of big government, federal intervention, and telling states exactly what they couldn't do, mostly regarding the owning of other human beings. Abraham Lincoln was their poster boy, a man who loved the Union so much he was willing to burn half of it down to save it. If you were a Republican in 1865, you were essentially a blue-haired college activist in a stovepipe hat. Meanwhile, the Democrats of the mid-19th century were the staunch defenders of traditional values, keeping the government small and ensuring that the agrarian South could continue its distinct lifestyle. A polite euphemism for a horrific plantation economy. They were the conservatives of their day, fiercely protective of states' rights and terrified of federal overreach. If you told a Democrat from 1860 that his great-great-grandson would be voting for a party that wanted to ban plastic straws and subsidize solar panels, he would have died of dysentery on the spot. For decades, these lines were drawn in permanent ink. The South was the solid South. A block of blue so deep it would make a Smurf blush. Southerners wouldn't vote for a Republican if Jesus himself ran on the ticket, mostly because the Republican brand was synonymous with General Sherman burning Atlanta to the ground. This grudge was held with the kind of petty longevity that only American politics can sustain. But then things got weird. Enter the 20th century and the Great Depression. The Republicans, having spent the roaring 20s partying like Gatsby, suddenly found themselves presiding over an economy that had the structural integrity of a wet paper towel. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat who looked at the small government history of his party, laughed maniacally, and invented the modern welfare state. FDR's New Deal was the first crack in the ice. Suddenly, Democrats were the party of the working man, unions, and massive federal spending. Republicans, confused and clutching their pearls, began to pivot toward becoming the defenders of business and fiscal restraint. But the South stuck around because, hey, FDR was still helping poor farmers, and he didn't push too hard on that pesky civil rights stuff. The uneasy marriage between Northern liberals and Southern segregationists continued purely out of habit. Then came the 1948 convention, where Hubert Humphrey had the audacity to suggest that maybe the Democratic Party should treat human beings equally. This led to the Dixiecrats storming out, which is the political equivalent of taking your ball and going home because someone suggested you share it. Strom Thurmond ran for president on a platform that was essentially no, but the cracks were now gaping chasms. The real nail in the coffin, however, was the 1960s. The Democrats, led by JFK and then LBJ, decided it was finally time to sign the Civil Rights Act. LBJ, a Texan who knew exactly what he was doing, famously quipped that he had signed away the South for a generation. He was an optimist. It's been about 3 generations, and the lease is still up for renewal. This created a massive vacuum in the political marketplace. Southern conservatives, feeling betrayed by their party's sudden interest in equality, were wandering the wilderness looking for a new home. Enter Barry Goldwater and later Richard Nixon. The Republicans saw these disaffected voters and realized that if they just stopped talking about Lincoln so much and started talking about law and order, they could pick up some serious real estate. This was the birth of the Southern Strategy, a cynical but brilliant marketing rebrand that welcomed Southern conservatives into the Republican fold. Over the course of a few decades, the party of Lincoln became the party of the Confederacy's great-grandchildren. It was a demographic shift so seamless you almost have to admire the audacity of it. This leads us to the modern era, where the confusion creates endless entertainment. You now have people waving Confederate flags, the symbol of the rebellion against the United States, at rallies for the party of Lincoln. It is a level of historical irony that would make Alanis Morissette's head explode. It's like cheering for the Titanic while wearing an iceberg t-shirt. On the flip side, you have modern Democrats who try to ignore the fact that their party's founder, Andrew Jackson, was a man whose hobbies included dueling and genocide. They like to pretend their party history started in 1932, conveniently leaving out the century where their conventions were essentially Klan rallies with better catering. The party switch is the ultimate trap card in online arguments. A Republican will say, Democrats started the KKK, which is technically true, in the same way it's true that Australia started as a prison. A Democrat will reply, yeah, but those guys are all Republicans now, which is also true. It's a circular firing squad of historical facts devoid of context. The ideologies didn't just drift, they pole vaulted. The Republicans went from trust-busting with Teddy Roosevelt to deregulating everything that isn't nailed down. The Democrats went from thinking federal taxes were tyranny to believing they are the price we pay for civilization. It's a total inversion that makes reading old political cartoons feel like entering a parallel dimension. So, the next time you see a political debate where someone invokes the legacy of the party, remember the switch. Remember that political parties in America aren't rigid ideologies. They are empty vessels that float wherever the votes are. The names stay the same, but the contents have been swapped out, relabeled, and sold back to us at a markup. Ultimately, the internal switch is a reminder that in American politics, the only constant is the desperate desire to win. If tomorrow the libertarians decided that their path to victory lay in banning loud music and enforcing strict bedtimes, give it 20 years, and we'd all be arguing about how libertarians have always been the party of a good night's sleep.